Yo, welcome back everybody to a brand new video here on the second channel, and today we are back at it again with the tier list, because we got a tier list here for Indianapolis regionals. Of course, Indianapolis is this weekend. It is going to be the largest regional of all time. It is now time to do an updated tier list for what I think will be doing good at the Indianapolis regionals this weekend. Of course, our meta has been kind of figured out by now. We all know what the best deck in the format is. We all know what the top dogs are and all that stuff. But we're going to see where I think each deck kind of lies right now in the format, what to play, what not to play, just kind of like how good our deck's currently in our meta heading in to Indianapolis, because we do have some pretty interesting results post Orlando regionals, and even Sao Paulo making a bit of an impact too. I'll leave a link down below in the description to this tier list if you want to go try it for yourself. And if you want to enjoy the video, make sure to leave a like, and if you're new here to the second channel, make sure to subscribe down below to help me on the road to reaching 14,000 subscribers. It'd be greatly appreciated. But without further ado, let's get into the tier list. So starting things off with Charizard, we're just going to immediately slam that in S tier. Charizard Pidgeot is the best deck in the format right now. Hands down, BDIF. It's basically just going to dominate Indianapolis. It's going to be the most played deck. It's going to be very popular. I don't think anybody's going to argue the fact that Pidgeysard is really, really good. Now, there are different versions of the deck running around right now. There's the more straightforward Tord build with the Turos and the Prime Catchers. We've even seen the Tord build get updated with double Charmeleon, which is really, really good in the mirror when you're playing as TM Evolution. There's also the Hero's Cape Charizard builds, which kind of go for a little bit more of a defensive strategy, where they put the Hero's Cape on. They have the Mist Energy in the deck, seen as Pedro Paducci did win Sao Paulo with that deck. And then, of course, there is the Regieleki build of Charizard, which I do think might actually be the way to play Charizard right now, is with Regieleki, because it allows you to actually have a better time in the mirror match, because you can run them out of resources even quicker. And then you also have access to Regieleki, which is really, really good in other matchups where you can kind of loop Eerie, which is really good. But yeah, I do think that Charizard is best deck right now. We'll have to see what version of the deck pops off. I'll save my thoughts for that for my meta predictions video that'll go up on Friday. But for now, Charizard BDIF, no one's going to argue that it's the best deck in the format. I mean, Bibzard is probably like tier 2. Like, I don't know. If I'm playing Charizard, I'm not playing Bibzard. I mean, literally just put the bird in your deck, call it a day. Bibarel Charizard is just not as good and as strong as Pidgeysard. Still probably like tier 2, though, because it is Charizard at the end of the day. Charizard is very good, despite, whether or not you're playing Pidgeot or not, the Charizard is just still a very good card. Now, I talk about the Roaring Moon deck. So I do think that Roaring Moon is like both like tier 1.5. Both Ancient Box and Roaring Moon seem to be okay. Now, Ancient Box did do really good at the Orlando Regionals. It did get second place, almost taking down the entire tournament. And Ancient Box is definitely a very powerful deck, because it does do good against the decks that are around Charizard. One of the big issues with playing Ancient Box is that Ancient Box struggles a lot into Charizard, where it beats a lot of other decks that also beat Charizard. So technically, you don't have the best Zard matchup. Well, it's not unwinnable, but it's not ideal, obviously. But you can beat, Chien-Pao, Lost Zone variants are pretty good. Lugia is not a bad matchup. Arc variants are pretty favored, unless you're playing against, like, Arc Gudra. Your worst matchups are going to be, like, potentially Charizard, and then potentially Pidgeot control with a Noivern, and then potentially Esathra. Those are your worst matchups. Every other deck, like Gardevoir, Lost Zone, Chien-Pao, they're all really good matchups for Ancient Box. But Ancient Box does kind of fall victim to, like, the deck being good now, and people are, like, now going to tech for it. But I do think Ancient Box is good. And then I think the Roaring Moon Duo deck is also pretty good. The double Roaring Moon deck does have a better matchup against Charizard compared to Ancient Box, but the Roaring Moon double deck might have a worse matchup in other decks. Like Chien-Pao might be a bit weaker, and maybe your Lost Box matchup's a little shaky. Like, overall, I think that if you want to play a Roaring Moon deck that has a better Zard matchup, but might have a weaker matchup against anything else, then I would play the Roaring Moon double deck. But if you want to have a deck that can beat a lot of the decks that beat Charizard, but might struggle in a Zard itself, then Ancient Box is probably the play. Arc Armor Rouge, probably tier 2. This deck is actually still very strong. It's not seeing a lot of play right now, and I think that might be for good reason. The deck might just be more of a pile than anything else, but it is still a strong deck, in my opinion. I don't think Arc Armor Rouge is a bad deck. I mean, it's probably going to be a few in day 2. I do think it is still a good deck. I just think that it might, I don't know if it, like, struggles into most of the meta. I mean, with Chien-Pao being another really popular deck right now, that's not really doing this deck any favors either, so we'll have to see. Arc Gudra, probably more of a tier 2.5 deck, just kind of more, just It's fine. It's not the greatest Arc variant. It did get day 2 at Orlando, but Israel Sosa is just kind of a god with the rogue decks. But Argu's like okay. If you were to play Argu, you could also play Vulpix to help a bit against Charizard. And then, of course, we got Arc Pix itself. Probably also tier 2.5. I don't think that the Arc Vulpix Noivern deck does have a lot of power right now. It's not a terrible deck, because like if you can get that Vulpix lone board state against Charizard, you can obviously beat them, and then you're also decently well off into the Ancient deck, Ancient Box matchup, specifically with Noivern, as long as Ancient Box isn't playing Fire, which, if I'm playing Ancient Box this weekend, I am not putting a Fire Energy in my deck. I'm not respecting Noivern. I don't really care. But yeah, the Arc picks, like, Noivern deck's, like, okay. It's kind of just too narrow with what it's trying to do. It's just trying to be more of a wall deck than an actual, like, deck that can keep up with a lot of the meta decks. Like, you're probably going to struggle into more harder matchups, like, Lost Zone variants might be a little tough and whatnot. It's not a terrible deck by any means, but I mean, I probably would prefer it over Argu, to be honest with you. And we got Arctina, which is honestly a pretty solid tier 1.5 deck, just kind of in that bundle of like the deck's pretty solid. Arctina does boast a fairly okay Charizard matchup, which is obviously good, right? That's one of the things Arctina has going for it, is it should theoretically beat Charizard. I will say, though, Charizard, with how it's being built now and how it's kind of been evolving, I think the Arctina matchup gets a little bit better for Charizard, just because now they have, like, the Mist Energy, the Hero's Cape, just annoying, well, not Mist Energy, but Hero's Cape. Like, they just have more annoying cards for Arctina to deal with. I don't think Arctina, like, just flat out beats Charizard, for the record. Obviously, Arctina can still be a bit of a bricky deck. A lot of its draw engine is, like, relying on getting Bibarel in play, you know, using Judge, hoping that Judge gives you a single out to an Arceus V-Star. The deck does have its inconsistency issues. Obviously, when it goes first and it sets up against Charizard, you do have a good time, and you do have a lot of answers for the Zard matchup. But the Zard matchup, I think, is starting to get a little bit more trickier now for Arctina, but it is still a fine deck. It does have a decent Zard matchup, and I think that it's still, like, a decent play if you want to play an Arc deck. It's probably the best way to play Arceus right now, I'm going to be honest with you. And then, of course, we have, like, Bayonet Gardevoir, probably, like, tier 2.5. I think that it's maybe more of a rogue deck. I think if you're going to play Bayonet, the Guardy Bayonet deck isn't a bad deck, but I think its path for Bayonet is just overall a better way to play Bayonet right now. And then we got Chien-Pao, pretty solid tier 1 picks. I think Chien-Pao is, without a doubt, one of the top decks in the format right now that's not Charizard. It's probably, like, if you saw my top 10 best decks in the format video that I uploaded, a few days ago, you'll see where I put Chien-Pao. But yeah, I do think Chien-Pao is pretty good right now. It's one of the only decks that can somewhat stand up to Charizard. It's not a perfect matchup now that Charizard is playing cards like the Hero's Cape. They're starting to play Eerie, so it's, like, really bad. Like, sometimes Chien-Pao loses to, like, a really annoying Eerie. Like, you just get Eeried away. You lose, like, a Rod and a Retrieval, and it's really devastating. So, while Chien-Pao is really good into Charizard, Charizard's starting to be a little bit more hostile towards Chien-Pao, but I do think that Chien-Pao is, like, pretty, like, good. It's obviously tier 1. I think it's a fairly solid play. If you want to play a deck that normally can beat Charizard, I mean, Chien-Pao's not a bad play, because Chien-Pao does have, like, an okay matchup spread. The only issue is it does struggle greatly against Ancient Box. Ancient Box is a pretty bad matchup for Chien-Pao. Yeah, you do have Iron Hands and Greninja, which are usually, what you're trying to use in this matchup to try to offset the prize trade, but Ancient Box is still a very tough matchup for Chien-Pao, and that's, like, the one thing. But, like, Ancient Box isn't, like, going to be super popular. I'm sure we're going to see a bit of an uptick in Ancient decks post-Orlando, right? We're going to see more Ancient Box, probably a little bit of Moon Moon mixed in with it, double Moon builds. But I think Chien-Pao will be fine. I think it's a pretty solid play. Like I said, if you want a deck that can stand up to Charizard, I mean, it's not a bad play. Dialga and probably tier 2. I do actually think this deck is strong. It just does suffer from some issues, kind of like in the same vein where, like, Armor Rouge is going to suffer. Like, it's a very powerful deck. It has a lot of really strong plays. You have Dialga V-Star, you have Star Chronos. You can easily get, like, turn 2 Star Chronos sometimes. You're really lucky. The deck doesn't really have, like, an engine, though, apart from just finding Metang. Its draw engine is literally hope to find a supporter. You have a Greninja, you got Mew. The deck itself kind of falls apart sometimes. You either brick or you just don't have a consistency engine to keep your deck afloat. Like, sometimes you get games where you just, like, you fumble and you're like, oh, I didn't draw a single Metang off of a research or something. So it does have its faults. I also don't think Dialga is, like, spectacular against Charizard. Your Zard matchup isn't, like, awful or anything. Like, I'm sure, like, you do have lines, and I think that a good Dialga player can beat Charizard. It's not all about just bum rush the matchup. Like, you can definitely do a lot of different things to, like, offset the prize trade and stuff. But yeah, Dialga will struggle against Zard sometimes because of Radiant Charizard, which is obviously a big headache. But Dialga's like not a bad deck, to be honest with you. Esathra is also probably tier 2, maybe tier... Nah, not tier 1.5. I don't know. Espathra's like not a bad deck right now. And it has seen a lot more play. And it did see quite a bit of play in Sao Paulo, which is an interesting sign for where Espathra's headed in the future. I don't know. Calling Espathra tier 1.5, though, doesn't really seem right. I don't think the deck is, like, that good. It's definitely a strong deck that does, force a bit out of Charizard. It doesn't have a, like, it is one of those decks where it's like, it's not like Chien-Pao where the deck is like, it beats Charizard most of the time. It's a deck that like can beat Charizard maybe half the time, not most of the time. There's a big difference there. I mean, Espathra's not bad. It does do really good against Ancient Box and Roaring Moon, which is really good. So that is one thing that I will say about playing Espathra. If you want a deck that stands up to like the Moon decks pretty well, I mean, it's a pretty good play. You have the Bayonet, which does make your Chien-Pao matchup a little bit better, because obviously Espathra doesn't do much against Chien-Pao, but when you have the Bayonet, it does help a little bit. And I think your worst matchup's probably going to be Giratina Lost Zone and maybe Arctina. Those are going to be like your two harder matchups, but everything else seems okay. Like, at least you should be able to like compete with Charizard. Future Box, probably tier 2. Like, if I'm playing a future deck, I'd maybe prefer Iron Hand. So Future Box does have some cool tricks. Just being able to hit for a weakness can be really strong. Obviously, having access to the Iron Leaves and whatnot can be good in the Zard matchup. You do have like more of a toolbox of attackers to choose from depending on what other attackers you're running. And then we got Guardy. I think Guardy's decently in the tier 1 status right now. It's a pretty solid deck at the moment. It's definitely got an okay Zard matchup. I think a good Guardy player can beat Zard. You have the Drifloon. Mimikyu's really annoying too. Mimikyu is one of the biggest things in the Guardy deck right now, in my opinion, that can really force a lot of awkward plays out of your opponent. And then, of course, you do have access to the Screamtail, which is good. Guardy's still, like, not a bad deck. It's not as good as it used to be. It's still, like, a strong enough deck where I'm actually, for now, going to put in tier 1. I do think that we are going to see a lot more Gardevoir at Indianapolis this time around. Because in Orlando, the deck was still, like, talked about post-UIC. People were still playing it and talking about it. It did get top 4 at the tournament, where it almost got top 8 at UIC. It finally broke in to the top 8 at Orlando and got top 4, right? So Guardy's definitely kind of being talked about right now, and I do think that it will be played a decent bit. I think there will be a lot more Gardevoir in Indianapolis than there was before in Orlando, and I think that success will carry over, right? So I think it's a decent play for Indianapolis in general. Like, it's just not a bad deck at all right now. And I think we will see a lot more Guardy. Gholdengo. My boy's probably tier 2.5. The issue with Gholdengo is, like, with Charizard now starting to play Eerie, it's, like, really annoying, because Gholdengo's a deck that, like, needs to have huge hands to, like, function. And then Charizard just goes Eerie, and then, oh, hey, look at that. Discard 2 superior energy retrievals. I win. So that's Gholdengo's biggest issue right now, is just dealing with Eerie. But Gholdengo is still, like, not a bad deck. We got Lugia. I mean, probably tier 2. Like, I don't think Lugia... Like, the problem with Lugia is, like, it's a very, like, inconsistent deck. It does, like, do okay into, like, a lot of the decks right now. But even then, like, I still think Lugia will struggle against stuff like Chien-Pao being a pretty bad matchup, just because Iron Hands is kind of a menace. I also think Lugia doesn't have a great Gardevoir matchup, because Gardevoir can Screamtail your Archeops. Yeah, I think that your Guardy matchup's not that great either for Lugia. I don't know. Lugia just seems like it's fine. It's definitely a deck, though, that when it does set up quick enough, it does have the ability to, like, run anything over. Like, it is a very strong deck, and I wouldn't be surprised if Lugia still had, like, okay placements. It's kind of like where I would put Espathra right now. Like, it's not a bad play. It does have its bad matchups, though. Like, any deck with Iron Hand specifically is just not going to be a good time for Lugia. Speaking of Iron Hands, we got the Lost Zone deck, which is tier 1.5. I think Lost Box is in a fine spot right now. There's a few versions of the deck running around. We have the Roaring Moon Iron Hands Hoopa build that got second at Sao Paulo. There's the Shaman Groudon build that got top 16 at Orlando. There's also a build going around with Iron Valiant and Iron Hands and Iron Crown. So there's a few versions of the deck running around right now. I think Lost Box is like a fine deck. It is one of the only decks right now, in my opinion, depending on how your deck is built, that probably can actually keep Charizard on its toes. Like, having access to Raikou to KO their Pidgeot really quickly is really good. Having the Roaring Moon, depending on whether or not Zard's going to play Mist Energy, is a big deal. I will say this, Lost Box feels a little bit more worse for Indianapolis than it did for Orlando/Sao Paulo, mainly because I think Zard is going to start being a little bit more cautious of the Lost Box matchup. They're going to start either playing the Mist Energy, so you don't have a way to insta-KO with Roaring Moon, and they're also going to play the Eerie. Eerie is really bad for Lost Box. I've been really dealing, like, hard. I've been really hard struggling with Charizard with Eerie, especially the Regieleki build. The Regieleki build, I think, is going to be popular in Indianapolis this weekend, and I think that the Regieleki Eries like just completely poop on Lost Box. It's very unfavored because like they can Regieleki there and you can't kill them with Cramorant. So like you're basically they can just go Eerie twice. They can remove your resources. Yeah, Eerie's really bad. Depending on how popular Eerie is, that's going to be the main issue with playing Lost Box. Eerie is very difficult for the deck to get over. Like sometimes it's out of your control. You just have good cards in your hand because the whole point of the deck is to stack your hand with a lot of cards, and then sometimes you're just going to lose your 2 Mirage Gate, and that's going to make a difference in the match. So I definitely think Lost Box needs to be very scary of Eerie right now, and that's the one thing that hurts it. I think Tina's probably tier 1 also. It's just another deck that can compete with Charizard right now. I don't know how good Tina is currently. Like, it does seem good, but I don't know how good it really truly is because, like I said, Erie's being a problem. If Charizard's playing Mist Energy and Hero's Cape, that's even more issues for Giratina to deal with right now. But yeah, I mean, Tina's like okay. It's good against Zard. I mean, it's not great into like most other matchups, though, which is kind of funny, just mainly built to like kind of beat Zard. But it is Tina at the end of the day. It can still win games just because Giratina is a very strong card. So it's definitely tier 1 for sure. Sablezard, probably tier 2. There was actually a lot of Sablezard in the online tourney scene recently, but I don't know how good Sablezard truly is. I don't know how good it is against Charizard compared to like a more turboized build of Lost Box, because with the Turbo Lost Box decks, you do have more attackers to choose from. Like you have the Raikou, the Iron Hands, you have the Shaman in the deck if you're playing, then you have Roaring Moon. Whereas like Sablezard is more focused on the one prizers. You do still like have the ability to play Mew and Iron Hands, which we've seen some Sablezard lists playing. So like you do still have answers to Charizard, but I don't know. The more one prize approach isn't great. Also, not really having a Greninja in play feels bad because if you get like Ionoed and Roxanne, it's pretty scary. But I mean, Sablezard is like not a bad deck right now. I think it's the weakest version of Lost Box, but still not like a terrible deck. Miraidon, obviously tier 2.5. Miraidon, like funny enough, actually isn't even like the worst thing you can play right now. It's like outside of like a pretty bad Zard matchup, I think that it's like okay into like other decks. Like it's not just going to lose to Charizard. Like obviously, I think your Guardy matchup's like pretty abysmal, even with Iron Hands. Just not having Flaffy anymore does make the deck a little bit more tricky to navigate. But Miraidon is still like ironically like not a terrible deck, to be honest with you. And then we got Pidgeot Control. I'm going to put in tier 1.5. I do think that Pidgeot Control is an actual very strong deck. The reason why it's just not doing super well is because just not enough players are playing it, and also not enough like good players are playing it. So like you're not seeing like high-level players choosing to play Pidgeot Control to a regional because they're just not going to bother playing it. It's like, why would I play that when I can play something like Charizard or Lost Tina or Chien-Pao instead? I think that's kind of the big issue with the deck, is it just hard to play. Though I don't think that Pidgeot Control is still a deck that should do good in a tournament regardless. Like, I think it's still a very strong deck. It's just somebody has to, who is good at playing Control, needs to play the deck, master it, and they can definitely do well with it. I do think Pidgeot Control is still a deck that I wouldn't be surprised if we ever saw it in top 8. Like, if it got top 8 in Indianapolis, wouldn't be surprised. It's a very powerful deck with a lot of options. There's a few ways to play it. There's like playing it with like just Noivern and Chi-Yu and stuff, and then there's like the more cloth, Wigglytuff build with more like options. Raging Bolt, probably Rogue. I mean, it's a cool deck, don't get me wrong, but for the time being, it's just obviously more of just a Rogue deck. Snorlax Stall is tier 2. The deck definitely is getting a lot worse right now in the format just because Charizard obviously has like been able to tech for it. But Snorlax Stall is not, like, terrible still. Like, it's still a deck that can beat a lot of decks. Like, it still is fine to, like, Chien-Pao. Your Guardy match is probably not that bad either. You might struggle into, like, obviously, like, Lost Tina still being out there. Lost Box isn't fantastic. You probably lose to Pidgeot Control, Eat 2, so that'd be pretty awkward. Ancient Box, Roaring Moon is not a great matchup either. Arctina's not fantastic. So it does have a lot of, like, bad matchups above it, but it's still, like, it's Snorlax Control at the end of the day, right? It still isn't the worst deck. It's just the weakest version of, like, a Stall/Control deck. Great Tusk Mills, tier 2.5. I don't think the deck is, like, a rogue deck anymore. I do think that it's, like, fine. I'd, clump it in the same tiers like Gholdengo and Miraidon, where, like, it's a fine deck. Like, it's okay. More of a rogue deck than anything else, which, honestly, a lot of these decks should be, like, considered rogue decks, but it is what it is. We got Future Hands, probably tier 2. I do think Iron Hands has fallen a little bit. It's just kind of underwhelming right now into Zard. Your matchup spread still isn't, like, abysmal. Like, you're still okay into Chien-Pao. I think your Lost Box matchup isn't terrible either. Your Tina matchup's close. Guardy shouldn't be a terrible matchup either. I guess like they can go like Counter Catcher Scream Tail, which is probably abysmal too. But I don't know. Future Hand is like okay. It just feels like it's a little bit too like fragile right now. Just having these like glaring weaknesses like Lost Vacuum and just not being able to kind of keep up with Zard sometimes can be a little awkward. Yeah, it's like okay. Like and also with like Espathra potentially getting more popular, that's also not great for Future Hands. Definitely just a tier 2 deck at the moment. Arc Grabber's also tier 2. I'd clump it in there with like Arc Armor Rouge. It's not going to be a popular version of Arc. It's definitely going to maybe see some play at Indianapolis because it did have that decent placement at Sao Paulo. It's a really interesting archetype that does have room to grow for sure, and it can find a good placement here and there. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe one somehow gone to like top 32 or top 16 at Indianapolis, but I do think Arc Grabber is just more of a tier 2 deck, obviously, just kind of like with Arc Armor Rouge. And then finally, we have Gouging Fire, which just put in the rogue category for now. But yeah, there you have it, folks. That is my tier list for the Indianapolis Regional Championships. Like I said, Charizard is S tier right now, best deck in the format. There's a lot of different archetypes around it that are good, like Chien-Pao, Giratina are like, I think, the 3 next best decks, and then tier 1.5 are decent decks, then tier 2, and then just kind of goes from there. But that's where I think the meta is right now. I think that we're in a very interesting meta where like it's centered all around Charizard. Charizard's BDIF. You have to play a deck that can beat Charizard. And kind of looking at every deck here that's above, tier 2 and above, most of them do, have answers to the Zard matchup. But overall, yeah, your deck has to be Charizard, and I think the meta is very interesting right now, just because of all the way the format is going right now, especially like tier 1 and whatnot. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens at Indianapolis. But there is my tier list. Let me know what you think of the tier list down below. Are you going to be at Indianapolis? Let me know in the comments below. I will, of course, be at Indianapolis. I'm pretty excited. Honestly, still not sure what I'm even playing yet, but we'll see. I'm excited for the tournament, and we'll have to see what goes down. I'll have my meta predictions video coming out very soon for Indianapolis Regionals, and that'll be for me. Hope you all enjoyed, and bye-bye.